Welcome to We're People First, the Jeff Moyer Show.
Well, hello, everybody. We're so glad you're with us. Boy, are we in luck today. We have both of our wonderful ASL interpreters with us. Who you're seeing right now is Angelique, and she will be interpreting for the show while we interview the other interpreter that you've gotten familiar with, Kira. So just to give you a little background of what's going on there, and here's Jeff sitting beside me. So Jeff, we're going to talk about dedicating this show.
Yeah, this whole show is about human communication, and I had an experience in the last 2 weeks that really put me back on my heels. I had a dear cousin named Scott Shepard Smith. We're dedicating the show to Scott. He passed from COVID. He was vaccinated. He went to a reunion of skydivers. One of the guys was not, and he became sick, and he wound up going into a VA hospital, being intubated and dying. And we're dedicating the show to Scott because this is about communication. And I had lost communication with Scott. I take full responsibility for not being a better cousin. And I only found out after the fact that he was one of our greatest fans.
Yes.
He watched every show, called his sisters, you got to see this, etc. So to Scott Shepard Smith, blue skies, Scott.
Yes, absolutely.
Scott was, by the way, a paratrooper, a member of the Army elite paratroop team called the Golden Eagles, and a helicopter pilot, 911, a military helicopter pilot, and flew to the oil rigs in the Gulf later in his career as well.
A great loss to their community, I'm sure. I never got the privilege of meeting Scott. I always was hoping to get there. He was, in Baton Rouge? Is that where he lived? Baton Rouge?
Baton Rouge, yeah.
Right. And we hadn't traveled to the South, so I only communicated through Jeff with him.
Well, let's get on to some of the follow-up from the last show.
Yes.
What did you find out about U.S. Native American schools?
Yes, as you know, we've talked about the Canadian Indigenous peoples and the blanket that one of them was making for the lost children, for the children lost. And she, by the way, she's starting a second blanket because she got so many offers for ramps. Yeah. Yes. Now, what I've learned over the past 2 weeks since we've last been with you is there's also a huge investigation going on in America, in the United States, because they had many of these schools, and the same thing is being discovered, that there's lost children that died at the school, and the parents were never notified. There was poor communication. They weren't allowed to talk to their parents. They weren't allowed to use their native language.
It was the same story in any time we locked people away, but it was their mirror images.
The communication was cut off. And so we're following that story. And you can just Google for the United States schools, if you just Google Vanished. It's just that, and then you'll get a lot of information. There's a lot of podcasts going on about that.
The other thing I wanted to follow up with concerning the last show is the Paralympics. I said that I didn't think that people with mental health disabilities were included, and then we saw a piece on a local news show about a cyclist from San Diego who does have mental health disabilities and is in the Paralympics. I tried to research that through the Paralympics. They don't say anything about it, so it happens. And today, since the Paralympics are in force, may we wish success to all of those para-athletes.
Absolutely. I think they started August 24th, so this week they started.
Now, feedback, we had one of our viewers named Josie said something that was, really a wonderful comment. She said, I consider myself a very conscious person, and yet your show, what was the word she used?
Said, your show changes me.
Your show changes me.
Yes.
So, thank you, Josie. And
absolutely.
We would love to hear from the rest of you 6,000 people that watch the show, please send us a note through jeffmoyer.com and send me an email.
Absolutely.
But we get so little communication. And we know you're listening, and we know the show must mean something to you. Now, I will say that we also mentioned that we were going to begin a donation process. And what we're going to be doing in the next show is introducing that as a way for you to become members and let us know very simply why you listen to the show. And if you choose to make a donation, you can do it then. We'll announce that next week.
And what's really important about that is you get to tell us maybe some topics that you would like discussed. You know, we want to be of service to our listeners. And so the more we know about what you want to hear about, then we'll be able to structure the shows around
Or
that.
even if you have an idea for a guest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ideas for a guest, we're welcome. We're open to all those recommendations.
Well,
By the way,
go ahead.
I forgot to mention, we also heard from our friend AJ.
Oh, yes.
And she can't watch the show at this time live, but she always watches it over the weekend. And she's very excited about it and just cheering us on. So AJ and Josie, thanks for communicating with us.
Now, we're going to talk about, this is about personal responsibility and communication. Think about all the ways that people communicate with each other.
Oh, yeah. You know, and I did a little side research and, you know, goes way back to smoke signals and drawings in caves. And, you know, did you know the Chinese use smoke signals? I didn't know.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
No.
So communication has been so important for humans forever.
But person-to-person communication,
Yes.
you know, through a look, if you can see.
Nonverbal.
Through a touch.
Absolutely.
If someone's getting wound up, just a touch can calm them down.
Absolutely.
The tone of our voice,
Yes.
not only what we say. And that's why, what was that you learned about young people and their styles of communication?
Of course, as you know, technology has really changed the way we all communicate. And I read that in the age range from 18 to 25, the average person in that age range texts over, it was 1,900 plus texts a month.
Yeah. Comes down to about 65 a day.
It's about 65 texts a day. So, you know, that's right.
And of course, with text, you don't get the tone of voice.
No.
You know,
right.
you can, things can so readily be misunderstood.
And they're short, you know, they're short messages. So you have to kind of fill in the blanks a lot of the time, you know, so.
And think about all the ways that there are barriers to communication.
Absolutely. And the biggest one that, from my research, said was not being a good listener.
I'm thinking of
and George
barriers.
Bernard Shaw, right. And George Bernard Shaw said the biggest barrier is thinking that you're communicating with a person when they're not really getting the message. So
you're so tied up in your own thought.
For whatever reason,
yeah.
You know, I mean, there's a lot of things can interfere. Noise, they say noise is a big interference for communication.
But I'm thinking about things like nationhood,
absolutely,
race, class,
language,
privilege,
different languages,
language.
Absolutely,
I made a list, but we're hitting the highlights.
Yes. So it's a complicated subject.
But you know, think about War of the Worlds, that Orson Welles radio play in the 30s, and they realized that if everyone was fighting against the aliens, then suddenly all of those differences between us,
there'd be unity.
There would be unity.
The human race would unify to take care of people that were not human.
And certainly we are in this state right now of dealing with the alien crisis of climate crisis. And we had better start communicating and listening.
I hope so. Absolutely. Okay.
I just want to say one short story about the Dalmatian language. There was a woman that was the last Dalmatian speaker, and a linguist was sitting with her, documenting her language and writing down, wanted to document what that language had been, because when she died out, there would be no Dalmatian speakers. And he said to her, "It must be lonely being the only one." And she said, "No, God speaks Dalmatian, and he always is willing to listen to me."
Awesome. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Great story. So you're going to grace us with a song, aren't you?
Well, first of all, I want to have see a picture.
Oh, okay.
Bill's going to show us a picture,
Yes.
and I'm going to tell a little story about communication.
So this is going to be a picture with a young Jeff.
And there's going to be a little circle about where I am, but I'm going to, while you're looking at that picture, I'm going to play a little harmonica. That is a photograph that I suggested we take. It was an impromptu setup when I was working in the Center for Independent Living. So that incredibly diverse swath of humanity happened to be working there that day of our 100-some employees. One of the guys that was on our board was named Michael Williams. He had severe cerebral palsy. And I was afraid to talk with him because I was afraid to say, "Excuse me, would you repeat yourself?"
Yes.
I was afraid that would, I didn't want to embarrass him. I mean, so what I did was I sacrificed my communication with him out of my fear. One day I walked past him communicating and laughing with another woman a person who was blind, a woman named Mary Jane Owen I've talked about. They were uproariously laughing because she wasn't afraid to say, "Excuse me, would you repeat that?"
Right. Yeah. So how did you overcome that fear?
I decided right then and there that I never again would let fear interfere with my ability, my willingness, my desire to communicate.
That's
so
awesome.
I started with Michael, and then I learned sign language so that I could communicate with people who were deaf, even though I had to read their signs by touch.
Right.
It was not easy.
No,
but I wanted to,
difficult.
I committed to that and never again
Yes.
fell prey to my fear.
And later on in the show, you're going to tell us about another person that was blind and also learned sign language, and you're going to tell us a great story about her. So we're looking forward to that.
That will be coming up. But
Yes.
I'm going to play a song that is a reach. I've always been a cockeyed optimist and a person that really imagines a world, like John Lennon said, in which there are no barriers to communication, and a world when we can really connect with each other. So this is a song called...
Okay, now adjust
Just
your
My
mic here.
Spirit.
I moved the mic towards you, so you put it where you want.
All right, good. Just bring it parallel to that, down a bit, just like that. Here we go. So many years we stood apart, divided by our difference, while our hearts, what we believe in, knew many common ties. We stood apart among our own, though feeling in our hearts that we have much more in common than was keeping us apart. For we are just one people, we have just one choice, as we live here together, side by side. From the islands, cities, and plains, different colors, different names, here to know the best that we can claim. The one, the group, the whole, in tides of time we roll, and boundaries artificial will only block our flow. But one as one we see our needs, together we'll succeed. Humanity united and bonded by our creed. For there is just one planet, we have just one choice, as we live here together, side by side. Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jew, every people, every hue, here to know the best that we can do. So we must look inside ourselves and find the light within, then shine that light around us. That's how it must begin, and we will make our circles grow. Soon a joyous sound will fill the world air with singing in tongues the world around. For there is just one spirit, we have just one choice, as we live here together, side by side, by side. Wiccan, Buddhist, Taoist, Sikh, across each land, across each sea, here to know the best that we can be. Here to know the best that we can be.
Guest interview.
Well, there is Kira. Jeff's putting up his guitar. He'll be right with you. And how are you today, Kira?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
It's so lovely to see you in your other person.
In your civvies.
Right? No dark colors, no like black. I got my hair down.
Yeah.
Just a hippie at heart. I just never get to kind of show that side.
Well, we thought that you would be a perfect person to interview on the show about communication, Kira. I know that you have degrees in a degree in sign language. Well, tell us about your education.
Well, I started my education at Asbury, now university, then it was Asbury College, studying media communication, so television and film production and performance. From there, I got interested in sign language, and I decided instead of a master's, I would get a second bachelor's. Wow. So I went to Eastern Kentucky University and got a bachelor's in interpreter training. Wow. And that was in 2008, and I've been interpreting ever since.
Would you tell us about the history of American Sign Language? I know that I suspect that a large number of our viewers are people who have hearing disabilities and who are deaf, because as soon as we started having you interpret and we put the word out about it, suddenly our viewership jumped. And I suspect that we're going to have a jump again this show, because we finally were able to tie in to a Facebook page with 25,000 viewers. So tell us about, for those who are not in the world of deafness, tell us about the history of ASL.
Well, American Sign Language is credited as having its foundation in the early 1800s. Wow. When the first, I guess you could call it institute, the American Institute of the Deaf, that was not its original name, but when that was founded in the early 1800s, that is kind of when sign language gets its credit as being founded, American Sign Language. Uh-huh. But it was not officially recognized as a language until the 1960s. So we had quite a long gap in there when people were using and loving and developing this language, but it was not recognized as a legitimate language. In the 60s, it was, and shortly after that, the interpreting profession kind of started getting its beginnings and started rolling along. And then, of course, with ADA coming in the 90s, American Sign Language interpreters fall under the ADA as being required under law. And so then we've kind of grown in popularity since that happened.
But actually, before ASL was codified as a language, even in schools for the deaf, signing was not allowed. Isn't that right?
That's correct. In 1880, there's a very famous conference that happened in Milan, known as the Milan Conference of 1880. And it was there that it was decided that sign language would be outlawed in the education of deaf children. And so for quite a long time, sign language was not allowed. Children were forced to sit on their hands. Their hands were tied, sometimes tied behind their backs. Professors or teachers would speak with their mouths covered, trying to somehow force these kids to learn to hear. I don't know. But so they went quite a long time where sign language was banned from use, but it still lived and flourished amongst the deaf communities, deaf clubs, things like that. Places like Martha's Vineyard here in the States, which was it was a deaf community, a very strong kind of a deaf city. They had sort of their own sign language, and it developed there. So it stood the test of time, regardless of all of the times that we've tried to oppress it. The deaf community and the beautiful language that is ASL just keeps on trucking.
Yeah, Martha's Vineyard, I believe, wasn't it because of a genetic condition that many people who were born and raised there were deaf, and wasn't that why it was a predominantly deaf city?
Yeah, it did start that way, with a genetic kind of predisposition towards being deaf. Lots of deaf people, deaf families there, and then when the word got out, some deaf people from other parts of the country moved there because of access reasons.
Oh, interesting.
Like that. So it's not that way anymore, sadly. The Martha's Vineyard dialect has really died out, but it's still there in the history books. So,
Well, as I had told you, I did study sign language going on 50 years ago, and interpreters also do something called reverse interpreting. Would you explain that, and then we'll demonstrate it?
Yeah, reverse interpreting is kind of, it's an old term that we don't really use anymore. It's more called voicing now, because it's not really a backwards interpretation. It just is an interpretation. So, but that would be the practice of an interpreter voicing for a deaf person as they sign, taking their ASL and putting it into English or Spanish. We have trilingual interpreters that will take American Sign Language and voice it into Spanish quite often here in the States. So yeah, but that's the practice of reverse interpreting, which is now called voicing.
Well, I'm showing my my timestamp on when I learned sign language. It was 1975, way back then.
Yes, that was definitely the popular term in the 70s for sure.
Okay, so here we go. Now we're going to, I'm not quite sure how this will go. Angelique Pinkston is going to be interpreting what you say, and there'll be two of us signing, maybe signing differently. How does this work? Can you explain how this is going to work for the viewers?
Well, we're going to do a little test here. So we're going to see what you're going to put out for us.
Okay.
The language has changed a lot since the 70s. So you might even use some signs that I'm not familiar with. But I'm going to do the best I can. And then Angelique will take whatever I say and put it into modern ASL.
I love it. I love it.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
No?
Kira is looking very confused.
So I'm seeing, are you spelling like C-O? No. O-P. That's a P.
Okay.
That's a P.
Hold your hand over here. That's a little better.
Oh.
There we go.
That's a little bit.
That's not K?
K is up. So like if you're down, that's a K.
Okay.
Down the way you were is the letter P.
Okay, all right.
So okay. Oh, it took us that long to get to okay.
Okay.
You might need to fire me. Now, I learned sign language maybe 45 years ago. And I learned with a woman
Too high.
who worked with me at, is it CIL? C-A-L? C-I-L?
There you go.
Okay, C-I-L.
Whew, whew.
There.
That was tough.
My. Yeah, that was tough.
Well, it's interesting though, because that does highlight something that has been quite a struggle, especially now in COVID, which is taking sign language to a video platform. Whereas in person, you could sign with as much space as you want, but on video, if you're off to the side of the camera or you're out of the frame or something like that, it impedes communication. So that's been something that has really impacted sign language here just recently, and is a good example of how ASL is a living, breathing language, and it's always changing.
Yeah.
Yes, that's great. And you know, that's why our producer has been so wonderfully able to keep the interpreters large on our broadcasts. Because usually there's a little tiny square down at the bottom, and it's so hard. So we are blessed for that.
We have our ASL can be seen readily on small devices.
Yes.
So that's our intention.
Yes. I have a quick story if you're...
Go, yeah.
I was caught in the middle of that transition before ASL was formally recognized. I was employed at a large school for the deaf, which I was not trained in sign language. They didn't want anybody that was trained in sign language. My expertise at that time was with what they called learning disabilities. And the staff were forbidden to sign. Well, it went from a private school to a public school. And so the clientele was so different. And we were getting children that perhaps weren't even recognized in their family as being deaf because it was looked upon as, a problem. And so we were...
Depending on the culture, a sign of divine displeasure, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was from birth up through 21, the age range for the kids. And so these poor little kiddos that had never been exposed to anything but a sign language had to come into an oral-oriented school. And boy, it was really tough. But so I know exactly what you're talking about before that official transition was recognized. So yay, we're making progress.
Well, and you mentioned schooling, and it's interesting because when sign language was outlawed, a lot of the deaf teachers of the deaf lost their jobs because those deaf teachers could not communicate orally. They could communicate in sign. Absolutely. So they lost a lot of their jobs, which led a lot of deaf children to never see a deaf adult. And many deaf children thought that when they grew up, they would learn to hear because all of the adults around them could hear. And they never met a deaf adult because most deaf children are born to hearing parents. It's very rare for deaf children to be born into a deaf family. And so that was another not interesting, but really sad byproduct of losing sign language in education for so many years. Yeah. They lost those adult language models. Wow. And it took a long time to rebound from that.
Absolutely.
Well, even in the 90s, I was working as a musician, playing in schools, and I had I always closed with a song that I taught in English and in sign, and I was asked to play in a school that was an oralist school, and I had to go through the principal and quite a long process to let them agree to me teaching one song to this group of kids who were deaf in sign language. And that was in the 90s. So I think
it still happens today. It's language deprivation is a huge problem still today. And it's those kids that have that native foundation in ASL. They're the ones that excel in English. They're the ones that excel in all subject matters. there is no substitute for having a native use of a language. And that language window is only up until 5 years old.
Wow.
So it's early intervention for deaf children is imperative.
Yes.
Kira, what are your certifications? In what worlds can you be hired to work?
I am a nationally certified interpreter, so I hold a NIC certification from the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. So technically, I can work in any setting that I feel comfortable in. So my code of ethics says that it's up to me a lot of times to know what my subject areas are, what my expertise is, that kind of thing. That being said, I would not touch legal interpreting. There is a special certification for legal.
Right.
Legal is not my thing. That's not my jam. In a pinch, I could definitely fill in an emergency situation or some kind of something like that.
Yeah.
I could fill in until an actual legal certified interpreter could be there.
Right.
But most of my work is educational, post-secondary, theatrical, do a lot of theatrical interpreting, and a lot of medical interpreting. So doctor's appointments, ERs, surgeries, things like that.
Yeah, in fact, you're interpreting on the music videos that we're about ready to release openly. You can see, by the way, Kira interpreting, I believe, on Climate Crisis. Isn't Kira?
I can't remember. Do you remember, Kara?
I think I will be. I don't know for sure if that. No, actually, I think so. I think we did do that video.
So if you want to see or hear Climate Crisis, my new song with Kira signing and very powerful visual images. Look, check it out. Just Google it on YouTube. Well, Kira, it's been a pleasure to talk. Oh, yeah. Just one last question. What do you see the future? How do you see ASL changing or the world changing concerning ASL in the future?
I think in the future we're going to see a lot more virtual interpreting. A lot of what we're doing right now, where we're interpreting on computer screens, and just because COVID has kind of sped up that transition to virtual. Everybody's meeting virtually, Zooms and things like that. So I think you're going to see that go forward. And just as a side, I do not see things like sign language gloves and sign language robots and any kind of AI sort of sign language things. Those kind of things, I don't ever see those taking the place of real life people communicating in a way like this. So if you want to help out the deaf community, learn sign language, get on YouTube, look up sign videos, look up dictionaries, just learn that. Don't depend on technology to do that for you. Get out there. And even if you know 3 or 4 signs, if you meet a deaf person, if you know one sign in a whole sentence, use the one sign that you know. Just try, so I think that's where we're headed. But I don't know, it'll be exciting to see, and but it'll be here. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but ASL has stood the test of time, and it will continue to do so. Of that I am sure.
Well, the great Kira Beck and the great Angelique Pinkston, we are grateful to have you on our team, and thanks for the time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
People First Consciousness.
Okay, I am going to read an essay that there we go. 2 squeezes. Language is a civil right, but communication is a personal responsibility. On December 31st, 1979, my father called me at 11:15 p.m. in California, 2:15 a.m. Dad's time in Cleveland. Dad had lost his lower jaw and most of his larynx to cancer and over-radiation. His voice was a forced thin whisper. He spoke slowly, and I listened carefully, asking him to repeat when I didn't understand, rather than pretending I did. 4 years before, I decided that I would never again let my fear block any communication with another. That led to my willingness to say, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." Would you please repeat that? Specifically, I began to practice that simple act of honesty and patience while speaking with a colleague who had severe cerebral palsy and whose speech was difficult for me to understand. That conversation with my father lasted over an hour and spanned the turning of the decade. It was one of the sweetest, most poignant conversations that my father and I ever shared. We both recognized that his days were numbered. Dad lived in Cleveland, 2,500 miles away. Around that same time, I had begun working with one of the giants of speech prosthesis systems, John Eulenberg. John had told me about his own father's death and how at the end, their communication was reduced to hand squeezes. One squeeze meant, "Are you awake?" One squeeze in return signaled yes. 2 squeezes meant, "I love you." On May 23rd, 1980, I was scheduled to MC an international conference on the state of the art of VOCAs, voice output communication aids. The gathering was important because it signified a great leap forward in human communication, thanks to the day's emerging assistive technology. I was working for Telesensory Systems Incorporated, a rehabilitation engineering company that had just demonstrated a VOCA with synthetic speech that was as easily understandable as human speech. That breakthrough, and ones that followed, set events cascading that would ultimately break the chains of isolation for hundreds of thousands of people whose voices were not understandable due to their disabilities. I was going to be the moderator for the VOCA symposium, but it was not to be. Instead, I sat at my father's bedside within University Hospital in Cleveland as death approached. Dad couldn't whisper due to the oxygen mist flowing into his tracheotomy opening. The last exchanges we had were the simplest and most profound. Using John Eulenberg's terribly simple lexicon, I asked with a hand squeeze if Dad was conscious, and then we both signaled with double squeezes. My father died in my arms on that Friday afternoon, while in Berkeley, the conference that had focused so eloquently on the future of human communication was ending. 2 years later, I returned to Cleveland as Director of Rehabilitation for the Cleveland Sight Center. The Sight Center had been one of the evaluation sites for the telesensory reading machine for people with visual disabilities, which I was tasked to evaluate. The site coordinator from the Cleveland Sight Center was Jean Babinchek, a vivacious communication instructor who was blind. At the end of the evaluation, we had hosted all of the site coordinators for a seminar at company headquarters in Palo Alto, California. I remember very well a pool party where we relaxed over drinks and dinner in the gracious backyard of one of our teachers. Everyone was dressed in fashionable summer chic as Jean laughed, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt which read, "I survived the Cleveland blizzard of 1977. Her t-shirt seemed like the perfect statement for a woman from Cleveland, unpretentious and fun. When I became rehab director, Jean was one of my subordinates and a friend. As I got my bearings within the Sight Center, Jean advised me about who to trust and who to avoid within the staff of over 100 employees. But most importantly, she worked with me as I began to develop a new program concept, a computer access center. Jean would become the Storer Computer Access Center's first employee, and her enthusiasm and elan was magnetic and infectious for everyone as she began to create a model that would be a bellwether for blindness rehabilitation agencies. About a year after the Storer Center got underway, Jean began to have seizures, and it was soon discovered that a brain tumor was growing within her frontal lobes. Jean had gone blind very quickly as a teenager due to unknown causes, but now the slowly growing tumor, which had stolen her sight 2 decades before, was taking a new toll. A brain surgeon carefully removed part of the tumor, which he could reach. The surgery was performed, and she recovered at Cleveland's University Hospital, within walking distance of the sight center. I was able to visit her. She rebounded, although the surgeon had severed the nerve bundle that carried her sense of smell. A serious loss for anyone, especially for one who is blind and who relies on the sense of smell for so many functional life tasks. A few days after her surgery, I remember her wearing a fashionable turban as she laughed in the face of the loss as if to say, "Your glove never touched me." Jean seemed unsinkable, and her joy made everyone who was concerned about her relax, as if her job was to make us feel better. Jean returned to work after a few weeks, but I was shocked to see her without the smile and bright zest for living which had been her trademark. She had lost much of her previous drive and energy. About a year after her return to work part-time, which was all she could manage, Jean again began to endure seizures. A new medical technology, the MRI machine, gave the surgeon a never-before-seen view of her brain. The tumor, which hadn't been hidden within the folds of the mysterious brain, had grown and was now entangling her brain stem. A second surgery was scheduled to address this frightening new development. The night before her surgery, I had worked late attending an evening meeting and was able to drop by the hospital on my way home. I happened to be in her room when the surgical team came in for her briefing. The surgeon described how, based on the result of the MRI study, he could see how the tumor was forcing itself in an S-curve around the base of her brain. It was going to be a difficult and delicate operation. He would use a laser, and although he spoke with a confidence that seems to be the surgeon's brand, and although the surgery was absolutely required, I could tell that he was saying that he had never before conducted such a surgery, and that the results could not be foretold. When he left, it was getting late, and I had an hour cab ride home. So I told Jean that I would see her in a few days, and that she was in good hands. She gave my hand a long squeeze. I could tell she was afraid. Choked with emotion, she was unable to speak. The following day was the surgery. I went to the hospital the day after and told the nurses that I was her brother in order to get into the ICU. Jean's shaved head had tubes extending from the base of her skull, and her mouth was opened with a stainless steel ventilator that filled her lungs with each breath. I was horrified with the starkness of the scene. Covered by a sheet, Jean laid on her side with her back toward me. A nurse had followed me into her room and told me that Jean still needed the breathing machine, but that she could hear me. My low vision gave me enough information to see that a maze of wires and tubes were attached to her head and body. Jean's hand reached for me when she heard my voice, and the nurse, realizing my limited vision, put my hand on Jean's. Then she left the room. A steady sound of the ventilator and the regular beeping of several machines created a sound tableau unlike anything I had ever heard. I stood aghast as Jean repeatedly hit her thigh with her right hand. My hand rested on her hand, although her hand continuously hit her thigh. Then with a shock I realized that Jean was fingerspelling, using the manual alphabet which is used to communicate with individuals who cannot hear. I said to her, "Jean, I'm sorry. Now I see that you're fingerspelling. Tell me what you want to say." Her hand stopped and formed a letter. It took me quite a while, feeling the shape of her fingers, to interpret the letter she was forming. T. I said excitedly. Then Jean closed her fist and nodded as if to say yes. Then, ever so slowly, she formed each letter shape which I painstakingly interpreted. When I got the letter right, she fist nodded yes. When I guessed the wrong letter, she slapped her thigh, saying no. As the chorus of hospital sounds fell into an audible blur, I focused with all my attention on what she was desperately communicating. Finally, I put the 15 letters together, and I cried out to her, "Teach them to sign." I repeated it again, "Teach them to sign." With that, she nodded yes a final time, and then her hand came to rest on her leg. This simple sentence had required great patience from Jean and me, and of course it also required that we both know how to fingerspell. We were both emotionally and physically spent. I realized that she was telling me to teach her nurses, her doctors, and her family to fingerspell so she could communicate her most basic needs. I could see what I needed to do, and I shared my plan with her. She nodded her fist in agreement a final time. The nurse came in and quietly announced it was time for me to go. I said goodbye and left. I went back to my office and called the Cleveland Hearing and Speech Center, which had index cards that contained the manual alphabet. On my way home, the co-worker who was driving stopped at the center, and I picked up 24 of the manual alphabet cards. Then we went to the hospital, and we went to the intensive care unit, where I held my first little class on fingerspelling for Jean's nursing staff. I returned the next day and taught the system to the morning staff and her doctors, as well, and left enough cards for the nurses who I might have missed. That afternoon, her mother and her husband came to the site center, and I also taught them how to read Jean's fingerspelling. There are not many people with visual disabilities who know any sign language, of which fingerspelling is a part. In Berkeley, California, at the Center for Independent Living, CIL, 10 years before, I had worked to master enough sign language in an after-work class for people with visual disabilities in order to communicate with our deaf staff and clients. I was managing a new deaf services program as part of our expanding services for people with varying disabilities. When Jean Babanchak began to work as a communications instructor at the Cleveland Site Center, she learned and mastered fingerspelling as a bridge to her blind clients who were also deaf. Something had told me to fabricate the story about being her brother in order to be granted a visit in the ICU when she was so desperately in need of communication. Jean never returned to work. While she was in the general hospital unit and the ventilator had been removed, I learned with horror that she could not speak. As I sat with her and she laboriously fingerspelled her thoughts, I struggled to imagine how she could more effectively communicate to all of those she needed to talk with, in the hearing world. Bruce Baker, a friend of mine, worked on the cutting edge of voice output communication aids. I explained Jean's dire need and her inability to any longer use a computer keyboard post-surgery. But Jean Babinchak's communication background, again, came to the rescue. She knew Morse code. So also did Bruce. He invented an interface to a voice output communication device which could speak with a mechanical sounding speech synthesizer. After an afternoon of training, Jean had a new voice. After a few months of rehab, she was again able to speak in a soft whisper that reminded me of my dad's own voice in the years before he passed. A coworker and I visited her at her home, where she sat in her wheelchair and tried to put on the best face possible concerning her difficult life circumstances. Jean's medical expenses were staggering. I became part of a fundraising concert that we staged in her honor during a blizzard on Valentine's Day, 1987. Jean was transported by local paramedics, and she waited backstage on a gurney where I greeted her before I went on. After we had all performed, Jean was brought on stage in her wheelchair and was handed a check for $17,000 raised by the community she had so long served. The microphone was held in front of her, and choking back tears, she whispered, "Thank you." She received a prolonged standing ovation from the audience that had shown up to express their support. Jean died 10 days later. I might have had a yellow t-shirt made which could have read, "I survived the blizzard of 1987. I know that Jean would have wanted one and would have smiled, remembering how hard we had all worked to make it to her big event. Jean was one of a kind. As a curious, sighted middle school student, Jean had mastered Morse code. When Jean suddenly lost her sight, she mastered Braille. Jean conquered finger spelling in order to expand her reach as a teacher. Her native drive to communicate gave her an eagerness to learn how to use computers as well. Never before have we had so many channels of communication to those near and far. All of our technology can open doors of communication. May we use them all to strengthen the human family and find those for whom communication in whatever form can be a lifeline.
Instrument Corner.
Okay, so now we're going to hear about a magnificent instrument that probably is going to surprise a lot of people that it is an instrument.
You know, I used to say that the oldest instrument on the planet is a 9,000-year-old bird bone flute in China that was found in an archaeological dig in China. However, I learned through the research I did for this part of the show that the oldest instrument is a 17,000-year-old conch trumpet shell held in the Muséum de Toulouse in France, found in the Magdalena caves that also held cave painting. But
which is another method of communication.
Yet another method of communication. Right. Now the conch I'm going to show you. Would you get it for me?
I will.
This is I would tell you that I worked once in the Virgin Islands, and while there, I was able to go down to the harbor, during which time I met a gentleman who wore thick cataract lenses, as used to be the case, and he had been a conch diver, but with his reduced vision, he could no longer dive. So His nephew took over the family business, but he sold me a beautiful conch shell. I think it's been stolen, so I can't show you that one. But I can show you this beauty, which was given to me by my son-in-law and daughter, Eric and Laura Angel, following a trip of theirs to Hawaii. Now, this happens to have a piece that's broken off and worn down by the ocean. Just quite by chance, it has that opening.
Oh, I thought you had made that.
No,
it was
that's the way
natural.
it was given to me.
Ah.
And let's talk a little bit about the way the conch has been used through the ages.
Okay.
Now, you have a list there of all the places in the world. Would you read that?
All the places in the world.
If you look on your notes under conch, there's the first thing is
yes.
all
oh my
of those.
goodness. Well, there are quite a few here. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where should I start? Well, it says the Pacific Islands,
Here we go.
Central and South America, Southern Asia, India, Nepal and Tibet, the Caribbean, Malta, and Mediterranean island.
Malta is a Mediterranean island.
Okay,
That was my note.
okay.
Yeah, keep reading.
Okay, then it says
in Boston.
many species of the large marine, what are they?
Gastropods.
Gastropods.
So this is a large marine gastropod, also known as a beautiful sea snail, and quite a delicacy. Any of you that have ever had conch, it's a delicious food.
I've never had that. It says here, it goes back to the late Stone Age, 17,000 years, to the Magdalenian culture. Tell us what that is.
Well, the Magdalenian culture is what we know about the late Stone Age through excavations of fabulously maintained archaeological dig in a cave structure in France.
And it says next, the Upper Paleolithic period.
Yeah, for those of you who are archaeologists and anthropologists and paleontologists, the Upper Paleolithic period.
Right, and then it says mentioned in the Hindu
Vedas.
Vedas?
Yes, in the Hindu Vedas, the holy scripture in the Hindu tradition, Lord Krishna, right?
Krishna.
Lord Krishna blew the conch to begin and end battles. And there's a song, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho up to the walls of Joshua with ram horn in his hand. So in the Jewish tradition, Joshua blew a ram horn, but had the same effect.
Same kind of sound, I'm sure.
Great sound that can be heard over the din of battle.
And you have used this conch in some of your recordings, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote a song called Israel, and I closed it with
trumpeting the conch, right?
Because the ram's horn that I have was didn't give quite the great sound.
You're going to demonstrate. This is quite a sound. Yes.
I am going to. So this is.
Do you want me to go on, or?
Well, yeah. Let's finish.
Okay, it's almost finished.
Yeah.
Pacific Islands, Triton shell.
The Triton shell.
Triton shell.
This is called the Triton shell, as in Neptune's Triton. Okay.
And Buddhist priests would blow the conch shells at fire rituals.
Uh-huh.
The Fiji historic ritual at death of a chief. The conch is blown as the body is carried on the ritual path. In Malta, historically, the conch is blown to inform residents that the windmills are open for grinding grain.
So imagine that before telecommunications, before sirens, before telephones, the conch was used to alert people in the community that they could take their grain to the windmill for grinding. So now I'm going to blow this, and to do this,
all right, now I have to adjust your
Christy
mic.
is going to adjust these mics, and I'm going to turn away because it is so very loud.
Yes, it's very loud.
You tell me when you're ready.
All right. I think we're ready. Yes.
Now, I can play it like a bugle, I discovered. You can play taps with it, but it sounds a little tortured, and I decided it would be better just referencing it. So here we have the world's oldest instrument. And if you're interested in hearing it used musically, watch the movie Alien, where it is used in the score, or listen to the music of
Jerry Goldsmith?
Jerry Goldsmith wrote the score. And now there's another reference to Sacred.
Oh, Steve.
Turre?
I'm not sure how you say his name. Turre.
Turre, maybe?
Maybe.
And his group is called
Sanctified Shells.
So listen to Sanctified Shells and you'll hear conchs used instrumentally. Well, there you have it. We've covered a lot of ground in this show.
We have, and we're right on time.
So, you know, as we look forward to the next show, we're going to ask all of you to communicate with us and become members at no obligation, but so we know who you are and we can better tailor what we do to who our audience is. And that'll be coming up in the next show. We'll direct you as to how to do that. But for now, suffice to say that communication is a personal responsibility. And just as I learned with my cousin Scott, it's a responsibility we best not let go aborning, as the expression says, not go unfulfilled, lest we miss the opportunity and the person not be with us. So
are you going to tell us about next show? It's going to be our blind friends from Pittsburgh.
Our next show, thank you for reminding me.
Yes.
Let's stop and then we can use this as a piece unto itself. Our next show, the guests are going to be Mike and Jonna Gravitt, who live in Pittsburgh and who are job placement specialists. So they're going to talk to us about job placement of people with disabilities, particularly visual disabilities, and also assistive technology and employment for people with visual disabilities. So please tune in. I think you'll learn something. We'll see you then. But for now, if we each take our responsibility to communicate to heart, and we don't let our own fear or the barriers created by the illusion of our separation block us, we'll find that we fill the world and ourselves with peace.
Sweet peace.
Thanks for tuning in.